Welcome to the Cybersecurity Simplified podcast, where we take the mystery out of today's top security threats and solutions. What do cybersecurity and ranching have in common? A bit of wrangling, a lot of bull, and CISO Allan Alford, host of the Cyber Ranch podcast. Allan's 20-year cybersecurity journey includes serving as CISO 4 different times in 3 industries and working with companies from 5 to 50,000 employees. He is currently focusing on getting actual value from your tech stack and adding a human perspective to cybersecurity. So saddle up and settle in. In this episode of Cybersecurity Simplified, we will ride the cyber trails wherever Allan's experience takes us. Hi, everyone. I'm your co-host, Susanna Song.
And I'm Dave Barton.
And we've got quite a treat. I love it. I love the cyber rancher analogy with our guest, Allan Alford. So welcome, Allan.
Thank you. It's really good to be here.
And David, this is your friend or your acquaintance. Both of you guys were CISOs. Tell me a little bit about how you got to know Allan.
Well, it wasn't on the cow trail by chance. Although we were dealing with the same output that you'd see on a cow trail. We've known each other for years. We run in the same circle we have a ton of the same people in common, and we just happen to get to know each other. I don't say this too often, so Allan, you didn't hear this from me, but he is one of the smartest security people I know. And so when I asked him, would you mind joining us and let's just talk off the cuff and see what interests our audience, and he said sure. So happy to have him here. I consider him a friend, and again, smart dude.
Allan, so we've got thousands of podcast listeners who actually probably have listened to you and your podcast. Tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you get to, where you're at right now, and including your podcast?
Right. So I started in IT, standard IT operations, worked my way up to, the point where I was running a third of a global company's IT infrastructure and personnel and, doing the full IT operations thing. And I was the one who was focused on security and IT at that time at a video conferencing company. And I was asked by engineering to quit complaining about the security issues after they had released the product and instead come over to engineering and help them make the product secure in the first place. So I suddenly left a lucrative IT career and became a product security person in engineering. Rapidly rose the ranks there, grew, formed an entire product security team, got very successful, helped develop an entire product line of secure products. And eventually the new CIO came and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Didn't you used to be one of us?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "How would you like to come over and be my CISO?" And I was like, "But I'm liking this product thing." He said, "Bring it with you and you can run all the security for everything." And I was like, "Deal." So all of a sudden I'm a CISO. Flash forward, done that a few times. I was a guest on a number of podcasts and really enjoyed the experience, and just decided I'm going to branch out and start, I had another show I did with a partner, and decided about a year and a half ago, I'm going to branch out and start my own show. So been in cyber all these years, been a CISO many, many times, and been podcasting now for a grand total of probably almost 4 years now.
Yeah. How many episodes have you got, Allan?
Cyber Ranch has got, I think we just released 78 this morning.
Wow.
Number 78 came out this morning.
Nice.
Yeah, that's awesome.
This is episode 30. So
for
you
us,
are 30th.
We're way behind, but we're getting there.
Tell me a little bit about your background. Why is the ranch so important?
Right on. So I'm a 6th generation Texan. Grew up in the big city in Houston, 3.5 million people at the time I lived there. This was in the boom before the big bust reduced the population again. But we had land out in the country, and I grew up with cows and horses and goats and chickens and, hunting deer and doing all those Texas country things as well. And that was literally almost every single weekend of my entire childhood. I was out in the country doing country stuff. So it's just a thing for me. It's just kind of intrinsic. I was at a punk rock club Saturday night, and Sunday morning I was roping goats, kind of mixing that city life and that rural life together. And, I've continued the tradition as we speak. My daughter is riding horses today. So yeah, just,
that's awesome.
Kind of intrinsic to my personality, my family, and my culture.
That's probably why we get along so well. Because I grew up in rural Iowa, and while we didn't have some of the same livestock you did, dealing with the same issues,
Yep.
out with sheep and cows and horses and picking corn and all
Farm
that stuff.
boys.
Farm stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Farm stuff. Yeah. I want to know, I teased the similarity between cybersecurity and ranching, but in your opinion, tell me what's the common denominator? What's the commonality thematically between the two?
Well, so, when you're ranching, you've got a lot of long rides in front of you. You're going to be on a horse. You're going to be riding all over the property. And, sometimes it's trail rides. And of course, the old cowboys used to do trail rides all the way through the entire country almost. And, long journeys in a situation that isn't necessarily the most comfortable seating. And I think that's a good analogy for cyber right there, that
Especially for a
sometimes,
CISO, the seat
yeah,
is never comfortable.
exactly. You got a rough ride in front of you. You got a long ride in front of you. I think that's a good analogy. And then there's just the idea that you're trying to get everybody corralled together and heading the same direction. And some of those somebody's you're trying to corral might weigh 2 tons versus you're just a CISO on a horseback. Um, getting a 2-ton animal to move the way you need it to, along with all the other 2-ton animals, I think it's a really good analogy there. And I think Dave pointed out too, I think there's some output on the trail that's similar to what we deal with as well.
Are you
So,
protecting?
go
Go
ahead,
ahead, David.
Susanna. No, I'm good.
No, I was
I'll
gonna say,
wait.
and you're protecting your livestock from the bad guys,
Yeah,
the wolves are per se.
you are, and I think there's threats. There's the idea that sometimes this 2-ton animal doesn't want to move where you want it to move, but the animal doesn't understand, like, stay out here and you're going to get attacked by wolves or bears or cougars or whatever it might be, or bitten by
Right.
rattlesnakes or whatever. Come over here. This is where it's safe. Let's get you in the corral. I think there's a definite analogy there. You're protecting entities that sometimes don't even realize they need protection and don't necessarily want to cooperate because they don't understand the threats.
Right. So, Alan, switching gears a little bit, or I was going to come up with a really bad horse pun there. I'm not going to. Switching gears a little bit, there's some interesting threats coming out in the cyberspace today, and there's some interesting ways that people are talking about combating those threats. What do you see next 3 years as maybe the top 2 or 3 things we should be thinking about, whether they're here today or you think we're going to start to see them over the next 3 years?
I think ransomware continues to be in the top tier. It might even
Agree.
remain as number one over the next 3 years. That ransomware just continues. And that's ransomware coming from a couple of different threat vectors, right? One is good old fashioned phishing and, nabbing people's credentials and getting in that way.
Yep.
The other is 0 days and or unpatched attack surface where they can punch in from the outside as well. And it's interesting. I just did a show. We just recorded an episode of my show that hasn't even released yet. And a friend of mine has gone and done a ton of research trying to debunk popular myths and popular concepts in cyber.
Right.
And he uncovered this idea, I've heard figures anywhere from 50 to 70% of all ransomware attacks are because of unpatched attack surface. He's done a ton of research and has determined that number is actually much smaller than we all seem to think it is. That it's still largely a credential activity.
Okay.
So I think in either case that persists, and I think that's one factor we're going to have to deal with. Then flash forward and look at Solarwinds. Solarwinds to me was the tip of a very, very, very big and very ugly iceberg. It's supply chain. It's software supply chain. It's software that is intrinsic to our environment that helps us talk about, look at, detect, see, and touch nearly everything.
Yep.
And obviously a very, very ripe target. You compromise that software chain and you've compromised tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of endpoints around the world. And I think that we caught that one. We saw that one. We dealt with that one. That tells me there's probably another 5 or 10 that haven't been caught yet.
Yeah.
And I think anybody whose software touches everything is a ripe target.
Is a risk. Absolutely. Honestly, Alan, I've been talking a little bit about this. We saw SolarWinds morph into the Exchange issue, right? Because it was an outcome of the SolarWinds breach. I still think there's probably 4 or 5 big ones we don't know about yet.
Absolutely.
SolarWinds was in that environment, and they use that to grab data, grab source code, and some of these 0 days that are so effective we've seen in the last 4 or 5 months. I think if I could go back and decompile and run forensics, I think we'd find feelers or touch points back to that SolarWinds breach.
Right, where it's a second stage operation.
Exactly.
And then even ignoring that, ignoring the fact that it could be a chain of activity, you have to look at things like, I mean, just whatever, AWS. You know, we all know, oh, open S3 bucket, oh, you left your credentials out, oh, you know, da da da.
Right.
We all know the million and one things you can do wrong in AWS, right? I have yet to see the big giant vulnerability in AWS itself, right?
Me
It's
too.
inevitable that one day we will see such a thing.
That's right.
No
Yep.
way you can have that large and that complex a software environment and not have somebody uncover some really critical flaw in the system, right? I mean, look at the Windows operating system. You know, they've been hammering on it for years at Microsoft to make it as tight as possible, and
Right.
still every few years somebody finds this radical, you know, intrinsic to the OS. They have to actually rework the way they do things. You know,
Right.
look at the Intel CPU vulnerabilities. It's the same phenomenon.
It
Sooner or
is.
later, we're going to see the big one, and it's going to be in one of the hosted clouds, Amazon, Azure, Google, whoever it might be. We're going to see a big one there, and it's going to be a boat rocker for sure. Because again, compromise that environment, compromise everybody's source code, and we're back to that second stage phenomenon
Yep.
being entirely possible. So to me, that's number two. Supply chain is number two.
Okay.
And number three, I think, is stuff we haven't even really seen yet. I think, you know, people keep talking about quantum computing on the defensive side. Quantum computing on the offensive side hasn't even really begun yet, hasn't even ramped up
No,
yet.
it is. You're
Even
right.
if it's not true quantum, I think we're still going to see advances in compute power. We're going to see advances in algorithms, and we're going to see the bad guys be able to up their technical game such that, you know, it's always a race of our encryption needs to be this strong because it'll take them X hours to decrypt, and now it
That's
needs
right.
to be this strong because it's Y hours, and da da da. We're going to see a major hop where the bad guys get a big edge on us, and we're going to have to completely rethink encryption.
You're right.
And I think that's coming too.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the quantum computing? What is that exactly?
So I'm not an expert on quantum by any stretch of the imagination, but the whole idea is that it's computing not based on zeros and ones in silicon, but it's computing based on quantum physics, based on the manipulations and movements of what at the surface glance seem to be much more chaotic, but that actually have some control and some predictability about them. And so you end up with an accelerated degree of capability far beyond anything with today's hardware, just far beyond it.
Interesting.
Dave, you may have something to add to that one. That's about my level of expertise right there.
Yeah, I at the end of the day, Susanna, what quantum computing represents is a shrinking of, for example, 128-bit keys. I think used to be 10 years ago there was take 20 years to crack, right? With the computing power we had. With quantum computing, it's going to take seconds, right?
Yeah,
and so we even, and to Alan's point, even as we continue to grow our key lengths, to 1024, 2048, whatever, we're going to end up with encryption that with enough quantum computing can be cracked real time.
Mhm.
And now, think about the implications for just defending our country. All of our communications between our troops and active ops, it's all encrypted communications. But if I could sit in the middle and decrypt that real time, and I could know that there's an event happening or start to disrupt our armed services, potentially disrupt their ability to do computing in general, right?
Mhm.
That's huge.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of risk to this. And that's why, people like Alan and I've been thinking about this for a while too, is how do we get our arms around that? And I don't know we have an answer yet. But I think, Alan, to your point, ransomware is a indication that there's money to be made, right?
Mm-hmm.
Quantum computing, the bad guys get their hands on it. It's going to be about stealing our stuff and stealing our money. It's still going to be the problem we have to solve.
Yep.
Mhm.
At the end of the day, the criminals are, you have to stop and think about it from the perspective of what's the actual impact of a bad guy event in cyber, right?
That's right.
It's either theft or vandalism. Everything is reduced to those two. Vandalism, there's no profit in.
Right.
Vandalism is just, hacktivism and defacing a website or crashing somebody's database or denial of service attack. These are all kind of in that vandalism space. There's
Well,
no
and
gains there.
those guys, Alan, don't have the money to go after quantum. But
Right,
the other
right,
piece you're about to talk
right,
about is where our
right.
risk is.
Exactly. When we get to the theft piece, now you're talking about a business arrangement. You're talking about investing in your business to make gains, right? So if I could build a bunch of like Bitcoin mining farms and mine a bunch of Bitcoin, I can invest in hardware, I can invest in software, I can invest time, electricity, and money, and gain something on the back end. The
Yep.
bad guys that run ransomware campaigns and everything else, it's the same exact calculus in physics. If I throw more computing power at it, will I make more money off the back end? If I throw more bodies at it, will I make more money off the back end? If I take the time to research and hire researchers to find zero-day vulnerabilities, will I make more money off the back end? And the answer is yes, 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 and yes. And so quantum's just going to be another escalation in their path, and it's just an investment for them, and on they go.
That's definitely interesting. Something I want to read up more on. Tell us a little bit about your focus. I think this is really interesting on getting what does it mean to get actual value from your tech stack?
Yeah. So
Your approach to that.
to me, we've got sort of, people, process, and technology is the three-legged stool people always talk about in cyber. And you can question the value of any one of those at any given time, and you have to question that value, and you have to try to measure the efficacy of those three in some uniform way that you can report, to yourself, to your peers, to your team, and most importantly, upstairs. And so we have a lot of popular methods for doing that. We've come up with things like frameworks, NIST CSF 1.1. How compliant with the framework are you, right? That's one thing. CMMI, the maturity scale, 0 to 5. We've come up with a how mature are you? People have tried very, very hard to come up with return on investment figures as well. What is the cost of the risk? We've got risk quantification.
That's right.
What is the cost of the fix, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of effort and a lot of work people are doing in a lot of different spaces and ways to try to solve and settle that problem. For me, I joined a company that does cybersecurity performance management, CISO and CTO there. And what we're trying to do is not so much the risk quantification as much as the remediation quantification. We're tackling what does the back end look like. And so assuming you've come up with a satisfactory formula for risk, and it might be the traditional 5x5 matrix, you might get into FAIR or some of the more
Right.
esoteric stuff. At some point you should be able to roughly value, put a value on the risk. We're there to help you solve the what is the cost of remediation problem, as well as overlay that CMMI maturity scale. And I've come up with a new three-legged stool that I call maturity, business objective alignment, and risks reduced, right? And if you can be demonstrating those three things simultaneously, here's the number of known risks that I'm reducing, and here's the value associated with them. Here's the business objective alignment that I'm achieving, and here's the maturity I'm impacting and affecting by doing this. And if you can overlay that maturity across any and all frameworks that you choose to use with a uniform applicability of maturity, now you're really cooking with gas. And so that's kind of the approach that we're settling with, and that's what we're tackling where I work.
How have your clients been responsive to that? The three-legged stool
People are
approach?
loving it. We're getting a lot of adoption. We're getting a lot of dramatic growth in the market for sure. I think it resonates. I think CISOs have been looking for a way to have a one-stop shop to explain the value of their program, right? Like,
Right.
and to play the predictability game as well of where am I going to invest and what am I going to spend and what gives me the most bang for the buck. Well, if I spend 10,000 here, I can reduce that risk.
Yep.
I can alter that maturity score, and I can align with those business objectives versus if I spend it over here, it's three different things. And so you get some predictability and you get some reportability, and you get to sort of demonstrate the value of everything you're doing, people, process, and technology, all three. And you'll find, as you dig in, and this is where the framework intersection gets really interesting, you can find that you've got tech stack spend that's absolutely almost useless to you. And that's where it gets really interesting, because rationalizing the tech stack should always be done from a perspective, not just of simplification, which of course is always a good goal in its own right. But if I'm spending $1 million over here and I'm spending $1 million over there, and this $1 million is only giving me X amount on the business objective, risk, and maturity scales, and this is giving me Y amounts, why am I even spending that million at all? So it's not just simplification of overlap of what the technology does, but simplification and overlap of utility, just general utility, right?
Do you audit clients? How do you approach it?
We have a services branch, but we keep it very, very, very small. The goal of our solution was to productize it and get it to where people could be self-sufficient with it. And so,
Got it.
we have minimal services, and that's kind of one of our brags. Actually, is you can do this without us.
Yeah. Well, any final thoughts, David and Allan? Allan, I'd love for you to give me in 2 to 3 sentences, your thoughts around where cybersecurity is headed. Some of it could be what you've already talked about, but for our guests, for our listeners who tune in bi-weekly, what kind of advice or trends, insights can you offer?
Yeah. So I think for me, the most disturbing trend of all in cyber, and I'm as guilty of participating in this trend as anybody, is that the size of the industry is increasing dramatically in terms of the billions of dollars this industry represents. Um, the amount of efficacy we're seeing in reducing the threats and taking care of the ransomwares and the breaches and the denials of service and everything else is not proportionally increasing. In fact, sometimes it's going the wrong direction. So if we're spending more and more and more money and we're not seeing the return on investment in terms of actually solving the cyber problems, then we still have a very big, very fundamental conversation that we all have to sit down and have. And this is everybody. This is the practitioners. This is the vendors. This is the theorists. This is the academicians with the PhDs that are cranking out stuff like quantum computing and new encryption algorithms and whatever else. This is the entire cyber community needs to really sit down, look in the mirror, and have a real heart-to-heart with how do we solve these problems more effectively. And I don't know that I've got even the beginnings of an answer to that challenge, but I think that's the single biggest threat that we face as an industry, as practitioners, as folks that try to protect others for a living. I think we really need to sit down and have that conversation.
Agree. Good stuff. We definitely appreciate you joining us, Allan. I always enjoy hearing your perspective because you work in some different circles than I do. So good stuff. Where can they go? Where can our listeners go if they want to learn more about what you do?
Hit me up on LinkedIn. First of all, Allan Alford,
Okay.
Allan, Alford, Alford. I think I'm just IN, Allan Alford. I was in early enough to not have numbers or anything after my name.
Right.
So I'm just LinkedIn/in/Allan Alford. You can always find the Cyber Ranch podcast as well. I'm hosted over at Hacker Valley Media. It's a weekly show. I'm also distributed everywhere: Spotify, Google, Apple, Amazon, blah, 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 all the major platforms. So feel free to check out the show there, but definitely reach out on LinkedIn. I'm always glad to chat and connect with folks.
Well, and if they want to learn more about your company.
Oh, at TrustMap, that's easy. TrustMap.com, TrustMapp.com, TrustMap with 2 Ps.com. And you're welcome to come check us out there as well.
Cool.
Well, thank you. So thank you so much. Thank you, David, my co-host. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. If you have feedback about today's podcast, please contact us at podcast@highwirenetworks.com or leave a comment below. And be sure to join us for our next episode on the front lines with the DoD's new cybersecurity certification. Until next time, I'm Susanna Song.
And I'm Dave Barton.
And this is Cybersecurity Simplified. From all of us here at Overwatch by Highwire Networks, thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time on the Cybersecurity Simplified podcast. To learn more, visit us at highwirenetworks.com/podcast.